The storm came in from the west at 3 in the afternoon, and by 4 it had made the decision for all of them. Priya saw it first, the wall of it, coming over the ridge to the southwest, the sky going from the flat gray of a February overcast to something darker and more purposeful. She had been hiking for 6 hours and had been telling herself for the last 2 that she was making good time and would reach the road before anything serious developed, and the wall of weather coming over the ridge told her, with the blunt authority of mountains in February, that she had been wrong about this. She found the shelter by following the blue blazes off the main trail, the way the map showed, and when she came around the last bend and saw it, a 3-sided Adirondack shelter, solid, the back wall tight against the wind that was already picking up, she felt the specific relief of someone who had been wrong about their situation and found out in time rather than too late. There was already a fire going. The man sitting beside it was old in the way that people who have spent their lives outdoors are old. Not frail, not diminished, but weathered in the specific way of wood that has been outside for a long time and become denser and more itself for the exposure. He was perhaps 70, perhaps older, with the kind of face that didn't give up its age easily, and he was feeding small sticks into the fire with the patient attention of someone who had been tending fires for longer than Priya had been alive. He looked up when she came in out of the wind. "Knew someone was coming, heard you on the trail." "Is there room?" Priya said, which was a slightly absurd question given that the shelter was empty except for him and had 8 feet of sleeping platform, and the storm behind her was making the question academic anyway. "Plenty," he said. "There'll be more." He was right. Over the next 40 minutes, as the snow began in earnest and the wind off the summit of Whitetop Mountain turned the trail into something that required deliberate navigation rather than casual walking, 4 more people arrived at the shelter in sequence. Sam, who was 23 and had the expression of someone who had made a series of decisions that had led him here and was reassessing all of them. Greta, who was 57 and had been hiking these mountains since before the park existed, and who looked at the fire and the man beside it and nodded in the way of someone encountering a familiar arrangement. Marcus, who arrived without hurry and assessed the shelter the way he assessed everything, systematically and without visible reaction. And Lena, who came in last with her notebook already out, which said everything about her that needed saying. They arranged themselves around the fire, which the old man had built up as the group assembled, each addition of wood timed with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much heat was needed and how long it needed to last. The storm outside had made the decision unanimous. They were here until morning. The wind at the exposed summit of Whitetop Mountain was producing a sound that none of them wanted to be standing in, and the snow was coming sideways, and the trail they'd arrived on was already indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. "I'm Elias," the old man said, when they were all settled. He said it simply, the way people introduce themselves when the introduction is a formality and the important information will come later. "Retired, 32 years with the Forest Service in this district." "You know this mountain," Greta said. "I know this mountain," he agreed. He looked around at the 5 of them, the physician with her rational eyes, the student with his poorly concealed anxiety, the veteran hiker with her comfortable familiarity, the soldier with his watchful stillness, the journalist with her notebook. He took them in the way he'd been taking in the fire, with patient assessment. "The storm won't break before dawn. You all know that." None of them argued. 10 hours, he said, give or take. He fed another stick to the fire. "I've been on this mountain a long time, and I know a great many stories about this corner of Virginia. Not ghost stories exactly, though some of them have ghosts in them. Stories about what these mountains hold, what happens to people in them." He paused. "I've found in my experience that 10 hours goes faster with stories than without them." Lena looked up from her notebook. "What kind of stories?" Elias looked at her. "True ones," he said, "or as close to true as I can tell them." Sam said with the particular bravado of someone who is frightened and compensating, "How many do you have?" Elias looked at the fire. He was quiet in the way of someone counting. 10, he said. I have exactly 10. Outside, the wind crossed the summit of Whitetop Mountain and came down the slope and hit the shelter with a sound like something leaning against the wall to listen. "All right," Priya said in the tone she used when she had assessed a situation and found it manageable. "Let's hear them." Elias nodded. He settled back against the shelter wall with the ease of a man entirely at home in this particular dark, in this particular fire. "The first one," he said, "is about a family that camped in Woolly Hollow." This was 7 years ago, give or take. A family, father, mother, 2 children, the older one 12 and the younger one 9, drove up from Roanoke on a Thursday in late July for a long weekend of backcountry camping. The father's name was Paul. I knew him slightly, the way you know the regulars. He'd been bringing the family to this district for years, came through the visitor center every time, asked good questions, followed the rules, left the sites cleaner than he found them. The kind of family you were glad was out here. They permitted for Woolly Hollow, which is a campsite in the drainage below the main Whitetop Ridge. A good site, sheltered, with a creek nearby and a decent fire ring and enough flat ground for 2 tents. Not heavily used, which is part of why people like it. You can feel alone there in a way that the more popular sites don't allow. They set up Thursday afternoon and had a good first night. Paul told me this later. I want to be clear that what I'm telling you comes from what Paul told me, what the family told me, and what I observed myself when I went in afterward. The first night was ordinary. Fire, dinner, the kids in the tent by 9, Paul and his wife sitting up for another hour with the creek noise and the July dark. Nothing unusual. The second night was when it started. Paul woke at around 2 in the morning to a sound he couldn't immediately place. He lay in the tent and listened, and the sound resolved itself as his sleep mind cleared into footsteps, something walking around the campsite perimeter. Not through the camp, around it, at the edge of the firelight's reach, in a circuit that went from the creek on one side to the slope on the other, and back again. Regular, deliberate. The pace of something that was not in a hurry and was not lost. He lay still and listened for several minutes. The footsteps continued their circuit. Whatever was making them was large. He could hear the weight of it in the way the undergrowth moved, not the light disturbance of a deer, but the heavier displacement of something substantial. And it was consistent in a way that animal movement in the dark usually wasn't, not stopping to sniff or graze or investigate specific points of interest, just walking the perimeter in a steady circuit. He unzipped the tent flap and looked out. The fire had died to coals, enough glow to see the immediate camp, but not enough to push the dark back to where the sound was coming from. He could see his wife's cooking gear on the bare hang line, the cooler they'd cached properly, the ring of stumps around the fire pit. Beyond that, at the edge of what the coals illuminated, nothing. The sound continued. He could still hear it, the slow circuit of something moving around the camp's perimeter, but whatever was making it was staying precisely at the edge of visibility. Precisely. He told me this specifically, not approximately, precisely, as if it knew exactly where the firelight reached and was maintaining the distance deliberately. He had a flashlight. He turned it on and swept it toward the sound. The sound stopped. He held the light in the direction of the sound for a full minute. Nothing. When he turned the light off, after perhaps 30 seconds of silence, the footsteps resumed. He woke his wife. They sat together in the tent mouth with the flashlight for the rest of the night, taking turns holding it toward the sound, watching it stop every time the light came on, resume every time it went off. It circled them until the sky began to go gray, and then it stopped. And the morning was ordinary. Birds, creek noise, the 2 kids waking up hungry and oblivious. And Paul told his wife he thought it was a bear with unusual behavior, which was the explanation available to him. The third night was the same. The circling, the deliberate edge of firelight distance, the stopping when the light came on. Paul had done some research on his phone at the truck when they'd driven to the road for water that afternoon. He had looked up bear behavior, coyote behavior, the animals that might explain what he was hearing. And none of it fit. Bears investigated campsites opportunistically. They didn't walk perimeter circuits for hours. Coyotes didn't avoid flashlights with that consistency. What he'd described to me later as the deliberateness of it, the sense of something performing a specific intentional behavior rather than moving through the landscape for its own purposes, didn't match anything in the behavioral literature he'd found. His wife wanted to leave. Paul decided to stay one more night. This was the decision that I would gently suggest was the wrong one, though I understand why he made it. He was curious, in the way that intelligent people are curious about things they can't explain, and he believed, reasonably, that whatever was out there hadn't done anything threatening in 2 nights of circling, and was probably not going to in a third. He also had 2 children who were having the trip of their young lives, and whom he was reluctant to pull away before the weekend was done. The 4th night, the last night. The circling started as usual. Paul was awake for it this time, having slept in the late afternoon to prepare. He lay in the tent and listened, and tracked the circuit with the flashlight when the sound passed specific points he'd marked to his memory. Consistent. Deliberate. The same behavior of the previous 2 nights. At approximately 2:30, the circling stopped. Not gradually. Stopped. Mid-circuit. On the creek side of the camp. The footsteps simply ceased. Paul lay in the tent and waited. 30 seconds of silence. A minute. 2 minutes. Then his daughter made a sound. She was in the children's tent, 6 feet from Paul's tent, and the sound she made was not a dream sound, not the involuntary noise of a child asleep. It was a word, spoken clearly, in the tone of someone responding to a question. She said, "Yes." Paul was out of his tent in 2 seconds. He had the flashlight and he swept it across the campsite and across the children's tent and across the perimeter, and there was nothing visible, the camp empty in the flashlight beam. He unzipped the children's tent, both kids asleep, his daughter breathing slowly, eyes closed, nothing wrong. He stood in the middle of the campsite with the flashlight for a long time. The creek ran, the night was quiet, nothing moved at the perimeter. They left the next morning, a day early. When Paul came to the visitors center to check out, and I asked him how the trip was, he told me all of this. He told it in the careful, slightly embarrassed way of a rational person reporting something they can't account for. He told me his daughter didn't remember saying anything. He told me he'd gone back to look at the perimeter the morning they left and had found in the soft soil along the creek bank a series of impressions that could have been footprints if footprints were made by something with very large feet that walked on 2 of them. I went in the following week to look at the site. The impressions along the creek bank were still visible. We'd had dry weather. I photographed them and submitted them to the regional naturalist, and the assessment came back as inconclusive, which in my experience was the assessment that came back when nobody wanted to commit to what the evidence actually showed. I've been to Woolly Hollow a dozen times since then. I've never camped there overnight. Some places I know well enough to know better. The fire crackled. Outside the shelter, the wind was doing something sustained and serious to the summit of Whitetop, and the snow was coming down in the way that February snow in the Virginia highlands comes down when it means to, with intention, with duration, with the specific indifference of weather that is decided on a course of action. Sam said, "The daughter, what do you think she answered yes to?" Elias looked at him across the fire. "I've thought about that for 7 years," he said. "I don't know. I know what I hope she wasn't answering yes to." "Which is," Lena said, her pen moving. "A question about whether she'd like to come out," Elias said. Priya shifted position on the sleeping platform. She had her practical face on, the face of someone maintaining rational architecture in the presence of evidence that was testing it. You said the impressions were inconclusive, the naturalist's assessment. That's consistent with any number of— It is, Elias agreed. He said it without defensiveness, in the tone of someone who had heard all the explanations and had no argument with any of them. That's what makes the mountains interesting. Marcus, who had not spoken since they'd arrived, said, "You went back to the site a dozen times." "I did." "Looking for what?" Elias fed a stick to the fire. The flame caught it, and the light shifted, and for a moment the shadows in the back corners of the shelter moved. "That's a question for the end of the night, not the beginning." Greta, who had been listening with the comfortable attention of someone who had been in these mountains long enough to have her own versions of most stories, said, "What's the second one about?" Elias looked into the fire. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing between options, selecting the right story for the right moment in the right sequence, which was the art of it, and which he had been practicing for a long time. "The second one," he said, "is about a woman who appears in Hurricane Creek." Outside the shelter, the wind crossed Whitetop Mountain, and the snow came down, and the fire burned, and the night settled into the specific quality of a long night with stories in it, the hours ahead of them stretching out like trail, marked and unmapped at once, leading somewhere none of them could see from where they sat. 9 more to go.